A woman who refuses a billionaire's money usually has a reason. That was the first thing Charles Whitmore said to me, and at the time, neither of us had any idea how much that moment would change our lives. The morning sun poured through the wide front windows of Harbor Lights Diner, painting golden rectangles across the black and white tile floor. It was just after 7 o'clock, the start of another busy shift in the small coastal town where I had worked for nearly 12 years. I tied my apron, tucked a loose strand of silver blonde hair behind my ear, and carried a pot of fresh coffee toward table 7. That was where Charles sat. Even if you didn't recognize his face from business magazines, you would have noticed him. Everything about him seemed expensive. The tailored charcoal suit, the polished shoes, the watch that probably cost more than my annual salary. He sat alone, staring out at the harbor where fishing boats drifted across the calm blue water. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded without looking up. His attention remained fixed on his phone as I filled his cup. I had served plenty of wealthy tourists over the years. Most were polite. Some were not. Charles fell somewhere in between. Not rude exactly, just distant. Like someone who had spent so many years being important that ordinary people had become part of the furniture around him. For nearly an hour, he worked quietly while I refilled coffee cups and delivered breakfasts. Pancakes, omelets, biscuits and gravy. The familiar rhythm of the diner settled around me like a comfortable old blanket. Then Charles stood to leave. He placed several bills on the table and reached for his jacket. As I cleared his plate, I noticed the amount. $100. The breakfast had cost less than $15. I hurried after him. "Sir," he turned. "You left too much." A faint smile crossed his face. "Keep it." "I can't." "Why not?" I carefully folded the bills and handed them back. Because kindness means more when it isn't bought. For the first time that morning, he really looked at me. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, in curiosity. Then his gaze shifted downward and froze. I followed his eyes. He was staring at the small silver necklace resting against my uniform. It wasn't valuable. At least I had never thought so. Just an old pendant I had worn for as long as I could remember. A tiny crest engraved on worn silver. Charles's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. He looked from the pendant to me and back again. "Where did you get that necklace?" he asked quietly. Something about the question made my stomach tighten. I touched the pendant instinctively. I've had it my whole life. The harbor breeze rattled the diner door behind us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Charles whispered something that made no sense at all. "That's impossible." The strange look on Charles Whitmore's face stayed with me long after he walked out of the diner. I stood near the front counter watching his black sedan disappear down Harbor Road, wondering why a simple necklace had unsettled a man who looked like nothing in the world could surprise him. The lunch crowd arrived soon afterward, and the familiar routine helped push the encounter to the back of my mind. Orders were called out. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Conversations drifted through the room like background music. Yet every now and then, my fingers found their way to the pendant resting against my chest. I had worn it for as long as I could remember. The silver was worn smooth around the edges from decades of handling. Growing up, I used to ask my adoptive mother where it came from. She never had much of an answer. According to her, the necklace had been pinned to the blanket I was wrapped in when I arrived at the adoption agency as a baby. No note, no family name, no explanation, just the pendant. By late afternoon, clouds had begun rolling in from the Atlantic. The bright morning sunlight faded into a soft gray haze that covered the harbor. I finished my shift and stepped outside carrying a small paper bag with leftover pie slices from the diner. The salty ocean air felt cool against my face. My little blue sedan sat alone near the edge of the parking lot. As I reached for the driver's side door, I heard footsteps behind me. "Margaret." I turned. Charles stood several yards away. He had removed his suit jacket, and for the first time all day, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired man carrying something heavy. "You came back?" I said. "I needed to ask you something." His voice was calm, but there was tension underneath it. The kind people try to hide when they are afraid of the answer. I nodded cautiously. "All right." His eyes moved briefly to the pendant again. "You said you have had that necklace your whole life." "Yes." "And you were adopted?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "How did you know that?" For several seconds he did not answer. A fishing boat horn echoed across the harbor. Somewhere behind us a gull cried overhead. Charles slowly reached into his wallet and removed a faded photograph. The edges were bent with age. He handed it to me. My breath caught instantly. The picture showed a young woman holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Around the baby's tiny neck hung a familiar silver pendant. The same crest, the same shape, the same necklace I was wearing right now. Charles looked directly into my eyes. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I think that photograph was taken 40 years ago, and I think that baby might be you." The photograph trembled slightly in my hands. I stared at the image again, searching for some detail that would prove this was all a misunderstanding. But the pendant was unmistakable. Every curve, every mark, every tiny scratch etched into the silver seemed identical to the one resting against my chest. The young woman in the picture could not have been more than her early 20s. She had soft features and light hair pulled back from her face. She looked happy, hopeful, the kind of look people have when they believe life is about to begin. "Who is she?" I finally asked. Charles took a slow breath. The gray sky above the harbor had darkened even more, and a cold breeze swept across the parking lot. "Her name was Caroline Whitmore," he said quietly. "My sister." I looked up. His jaw tightened. She disappeared decades ago. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cars moved along the road beyond the harbor. A few tourists wandered past carrying shopping bags. The world continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. "Charles," I said carefully, "there are thousands of necklaces in the world. Similar photographs. Similar stories." "I know. Then why are you so certain?" He looked directly at me. "Because my family commissioned that pendant. There were only 2 ever made." My heartbeat quickened. 2. He nodded. "One belonged to my sister. The other belonged to my mother." I lowered my eyes to the photograph again. Questions crowded my mind. Questions I had never expected to ask. Questions I had spent 62 years living without answers. "I do not remember anything before my adoption," I admitted. "I was too young." "Do you know the agency?" he asked. "Only the name." "Do you still have the paperwork?" "Some of it." Charles became very still. I could almost see his mind working through possibilities. Facts, dates, connections. The careful calculations of a man who had spent his life solving problems. Yet beneath all that logic was something else. Hope, fragile and uncertain. "Would you be willing to show me the documents?" he asked. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to walk away. For years I had accepted that certain questions would never be answered. I had built a good life without knowing where I came from. But now, standing in a harbor parking lot beneath a darkening sky, I was holding a photograph that seemed to connect me to a past I never knew existed. "All right," I said softly. Relief flickered across Charles's face before he quickly hid it. "Thank you." As we prepared to leave, a strange feeling settled over me. Not certainty, not belief, just a quiet awareness that a door had opened. And once opened, it could never be closed again. The next afternoon, rain tapped softly against the windows of my small house overlooking the harbor. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen as I spread old documents across the dining table. Adoption records, school certificates, faded photographs, pieces of a life that suddenly felt incomplete. At exactly 3 o'clock, Charles arrived. This time he was not wearing an expensive suit. Instead, he wore a simple navy sweater and dark slacks. Somehow that made him seem more approachable, more human. We sat across from each other beneath the warm yellow glow of the hanging light fixture. For several minutes, neither of us spoke much. We simply examined the paperwork. Charles handled each document with surprising care, as though every page might contain an answer he had spent decades searching for. "This is the agency," he said quietly, pointing to a letter dated more than 40 years earlier. "It closed years ago." I nodded. "My adoptive parents told me most of the records were lost." Charles studied the paper. His expression grew thoughtful. "Not all records disappear." The confidence in his voice caught my attention. He reached into a leather folder and removed several copies of documents of his own. Old newspaper clippings, family photographs, hospital references. The image of Caroline appeared again and again. At a graduation celebration, at a family picnic, standing beside a sailboat with the same bright smile I had seen in the faded photograph from the harbor. The more I looked at her face, the more unsettled I became. There were similarities I could not ignore. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the jaw, even the way she tilted her head slightly when smiling. Coincidences, perhaps, yet they felt larger than coincidence. Outside, the rain intensified. Water streamed down the windows in silver ribbons. Charles leaned back in his chair and stared at a photograph for several seconds before speaking. My family never stopped looking for her. His voice was softer now. Most people eventually accepted that she was gone. My mother never did. I looked down at my hands. If what you think is true, I paused. Why did nobody ever find me? Charles did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, "That is exactly what I intend to discover." Something shifted inside me then. The curiosity I had felt since our first meeting was changing into something deeper. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether the missing pieces of my life had been waiting all these years for someone determined enough to uncover them. As the storm continued outside, Charles carefully gathered the documents and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart pound. "Margaret," he said, "there is one file that may contain everything. And tomorrow, I think I know where to find it." The following morning began with clear skies and bright sunlight reflecting off the harbor water. The storm had passed, but the tension inside me had not. I arrived at the diner earlier than usual, yet I found it impossible to focus on work. Every time the front door opened, I glanced up expecting to see Charles. Around 10 o'clock, he finally appeared. His expression told me immediately that something had happened. Not certainty, but progress. "Can you take a break?" he asked quietly. 20 minutes later, we were driving inland through rolling countryside painted with early autumn colors. Golden leaves drifted across the highway while sunlight flashed through the trees. Charles explained very little during the drive. He seemed focused, almost cautious, as though he did not want to build expectations too quickly. Nearly an hour later, we arrived at a small brick building tucked between an old courthouse and a historical records center. The sign outside identified it as a private archival storage facility. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust. Rows of filing cabinets stretched beneath soft overhead lighting. Waiting near the front desk was a woman in her early 40s wearing glasses and carrying several folders. "Margaret, this is Evelyn Brooks," Charles said. "She has been helping me trace some of the older records." Evelyn offered a warm smile. "I think we found something important." My pulse quickened. She led us into a quiet conference room where several documents had already been arranged across a large oak table. Some were adoption records. Others appeared to be hospital references and administrative reports dating back more than 4 decades. Evelyn carefully opened a folder. "Most of the original files were destroyed when the agency closed," she explained. "But some secondary records survived because copies were submitted to state archives." Charles leaned forward. I could see the tension in his shoulders. Evelyn turned one page toward us. My eyes immediately locked onto a date. It matched the approximate date listed in my adoption paperwork. Another page revealed a handwritten note from a caseworker. Then another. Piece by piece, fragments of a forgotten story began to emerge. None of it proved anything yet. But the coincidences were becoming harder to dismiss. Very hard. My hands rested motionless on the table as I listened. The room seemed unusually quiet. Even the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than normal. Then Evelyn opened the final folder. Unlike the others, this one contained only a single sheet of paper. Her expression changed slightly. "This," she said, "is the document we almost missed." Charles and I exchanged a glance. Evelyn slowly slid the page across the table. At the top was a name neither of us expected to see. Caroline Whitmore. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The name seemed to pull all the air from the room. I stared at the document while my heart pounded against my ribs. Beneath Caroline Whitmore's name was a reference number connected to a confidential case file. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and carefully reviewed the page again. "This record was attached to a transfer request," she explained. "The original file is incomplete, but there is enough information here to establish a connection between the hospital and the adoption agency." Charles remained motionless. His eyes never left the paper. I could see years of unanswered questions gathering behind his expression, questions he had likely carried for most of his life. Evelyn continued turning pages. "There is something else." She opened another folder and removed a photocopy of an intake form. The paper had yellowed with age. Portions of the text were faded, but several details remained legible. A female infant. Approximate age. Medical observations. Transfer authorization. My throat tightened as I listened. Every line felt strangely personal, as though I were reading the opening chapter of my own life without recognizing the author. Can this prove anything? I finally asked. Evelyn shook her head gently. Not by itself. The answer disappointed me more than I expected. Charles leaned back in his chair and stared toward the window where afternoon sunlight streamed across the parking lot outside. Then we need something that can. His voice was calm, but there was determination behind it now, a level I had not seen before. The investigation had moved beyond curiosity, beyond coincidence. We had reached a point where only facts mattered. Absolute facts. Evelyn folded her hands together. There is one option. The room became quiet again. I already knew what she was about to say. Charles knew too. Neither of us spoke first. A DNA test, Evelyn said. The words landed heavily between us. I looked down at the table. Part of me wanted answers more than anything. Another part was afraid of them. For 62 years, I had lived one version of my life. What if the truth changed everything? What if it changed nothing? Charles finally looked at me. Margaret, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I will respect whatever decision you make. That surprised me. I had expected pressure. Instead, I heard sincerity. For a long moment, I studied the documents scattered across the table. The pendant, the photograph, Caroline's name, the adoption records. Too many pieces were fitting together. Slowly, I reached for my necklace and closed my fingers around the worn silver crest. If we do this, I said quietly, we find out the truth. Whatever that truth is. Charles nodded. Yes. I drew a slow breath. Then I gave the answer that would change both of our lives. All right, I said. Let us do the test. The DNA samples were collected the following week. The process itself was simple. A few signatures. A brief appointment. A sterile office illuminated by bright white lights. Yet nothing about it felt simple to me. As Dr. Nathan Cole sealed the samples into labeled containers, I found myself staring through the laboratory window at the parking lot outside. Cars came and went. People carried on with ordinary lives. Meanwhile, mine seemed suspended between two different realities. One where I remained exactly who I had always believed I was, and another where everything could change. The waiting proved harder than the test itself. Days passed. Then another week. Autumn settled more deeply over the town. The trees lining Harbor Road turned shades of gold and crimson. At the diner, customers came and went as usual. I poured coffee, cleared tables, smiled politely. But every evening when I returned home, the silence felt heavier. Questions followed me everywhere. Charles called occasionally, never pushing, never demanding updates. Yet I could hear the same tension in his voice that lived inside me. He was waiting too. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the samples were submitted, I stood behind the diner counter watching rain drift across the harbor. The sky was gray. The water was darker than usual. My shift had just ended when my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. My stomach tightened. Margaret, Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, but unusually serious. The results are ready. For a moment, I could not speak. The sounds of the diner seemed to fade into the background. Cups clinked. A coffee machine hissed. Someone laughed near the front entrance. Everything felt distant. When? I finally asked. Tomorrow morning. That night, I barely slept. Memories I did not even know I possessed seemed to surface from nowhere. The photograph. Caroline's smile. The necklace. The old records. Every piece of the puzzle replayed endlessly in my mind. By sunrise, I had already been awake for hours. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Evelyn's office. When I arrived, Charles was already there. He stood near the window, overlooking the city streets below. He turned as I entered. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us knew what to expect. Evelyn sat at the conference table with a sealed folder in front of her. Dr. Nathan Cole occupied the chair beside her. The room was warm, yet my hands felt cold. Everyone took their seats. The city skyline glowed beneath clear morning sunlight outside the glass walls. Dr. Cole placed one hand gently on the folder. Then he looked directly at both of us. I have reviewed the results several times, he said. There is no uncertainty in the findings. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Charles leaned forward slightly. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then Dr. Cole opened the folder. The sound of paper sliding across the conference table seemed impossibly loud. Dr. Cole studied the report one final time before lifting his eyes toward us. His expression was professional, But there was something else there as well. Something human. Something that suggested he understood the weight of the moment. The results indicate a direct biological relationship, he said carefully. My breath caught. Beside me, Charles remained completely still. Based on the genetic markers analyzed, Dr. Cole continued, the probability exceeds 99.9%. The room fell silent. I stared at the report without truly seeing it. The words seemed distant. Unreal. For 62 years I had lived without knowing where I came from. Now, in a matter of seconds, that mystery had changed forever. Charles slowly lowered his gaze. I had never seen him look vulnerable before. Not in the diner. Not during the investigation. Not even when we first discovered Caroline's name in the records. But now his composure cracked. Only slightly. Yet enough for me to see it. So it is true, he said quietly. Dr. Cole nodded. Yes. Nobody spoke for several moments. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, traffic moved through the city below. Sunlight reflected from neighboring buildings. Ordinary life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything felt different. Evelyn finally broke the silence. The documentation strongly supports what the DNA confirms. She opened another folder and carefully organized several pages. The records indicate that Caroline gave birth shortly before her disappearance. Administrative errors during the transfer process appear to have separated the child from all identifying family information. I closed my eyes briefly. A lifetime of unanswered questions suddenly had context. Not complete answers. Not yet. But context. Charles leaned back slowly. His hands rested motionless on the table. My mother searched for decades, he said. She never stopped. His voice grew softer. She died believing she had failed. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. Not because I remembered her. I did not. But because somewhere in another version of life, we might have known each other. Across the table, Evelyn gently pushed a photograph toward me. It showed Caroline standing beside an older woman. Both were smiling. Family resemblance was unmistakable. For the first time, I saw traces of my own face reflected back through generations I had never known. Tears gathered in my eyes, but I blinked them away. Then something unexpected happened. Charles reached into his briefcase and removed a small velvet box. He opened it carefully. Inside rested an antique silver brooch bearing the same crest engraved on my necklace. The same symbol. The same family mark. This belonged to my mother, he said. She carried it every day. My fingers tightened around the pendant at my neck. For years I believed it was simply an old piece of jewelry. Now it felt like a bridge stretching across 4 decades of separation. A bridge that had finally led me home. 3 months later, life looked very different, yet in many ways it remained exactly the same. Every morning I still arrived at Harbor Lights Diner before sunrise. I still tied my apron. I still poured coffee for fishermen heading out to sea and travelers passing through town. The difference was not in my surroundings. The difference was in what I now knew. The questions that had followed me for 62 years had finally been answered. The uncertainty was gone. One crisp autumn afternoon, Charles invited me to visit the Whitmore family estate. The property sat on a hill overlooking hundreds of acres of rolling countryside painted in shades of gold and amber. As we drove through the front gates, I felt nervous in a way I had not expected. Not because of the size of the estate, not because of the wealth, but because every step brought me closer to a history that should have been mine all along. Inside the main house, sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated walls covered with family photographs. Generations of faces looked back at me. Some were strangers, some were not. More than once I stopped and stared because I recognized familiar features. A smile, a pair of eyes, the shape of a jawline, pieces of myself reflected in people I had never met. Charles guided me into a quiet sitting room. Waiting there was a large photo album. It had belonged to his mother. Slowly, carefully, we turned the pages together. There was Caroline as a child. Caroline graduating from college. Caroline laughing beside a lake on a summer afternoon. Page after page revealed a life interrupted by circumstances nobody had fully understood. At one point, Charles closed the album and looked at me. "You know," he said softly, "when I first saw you at the diner, I only saw a waitress." I smiled. "I know." He shook his head. "That was my mistake." The room fell quiet. Then he added something I would never forget. "The most important person I have found in years was standing right in front of me, and I almost walked away without noticing." Emotion tightened my throat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Some truths speak for themselves. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I stood outside on the terrace overlooking the landscape. The same silver pendant rested against my chest. The wind moved gently through the trees. I thought about the little girl who had entered an adoption agency carrying nothing but a necklace and a missing history. I thought about the woman who spent decades believing those answers were lost forever. And I thought about the strange chain of events that began with a cup of coffee and a refused tip. In the end, the greatest discovery was never about wealth, status, or inheritance. It was about belonging, about knowing where you came from, about finding family after a lifetime of wondering if they existed. As the last light faded from the horizon, I closed my hand around the pendant and smiled. After 62 years, I was no longer searching. I was finally home.